From the smoke-choked alleyways of Spitalfields to the terrifying silence of the condemned cell in Newgate Prison, 18th century London was a city eating itself alive. It was a place where the law was merely a suggestion, where the police force didn't exist, and where a single man could run the entire criminal underworld from an office right next to the courthouse. But while Jonathan Wild was busy crowning himself the thief-taker general and building a corporate empire of crime, he forgot to account for the one variable that would burn his whole kingdom to the ground: a 5'4" carpenter with a stutter, a drinking problem, and an absolute refusal to stay in a cage. To understand how Jack Sheppard became the most famous man in England, you first have to understand the nightmare that was London in the 1720s. This wasn't the polite society of Bridgerton. This was a chaotic explosion of 500,000 people crammed into medieval streets that were drowning in gin and coal dust. There was no Scotland Yard. If someone stole your watch, you didn't call the cops, you went to the black market. And the man sitting at the top of that black market was Jonathan Wild. Wild is perhaps the most terrifyingly brilliant villain in British history because he figured out a loophole in the system that nobody else saw while supposedly being the good guy who was helping you. The government, desperate to stop the crime wave, offered a massive £40 reward for capturing a thief, adjusted to inflation that would mean £10,000 nowadays. Wild looked at that reward and saw a business model. He set himself up as a public servant, a hero who hunted criminals. He carried a silver staff, he had an office, and he put ads in the papers. But it was all a lie. Wild was actually running the thieves he was supposed to be catching. He organized the gangs, told them what to steal, and then had them bring the goods to his warehouses. He would then contact the victims and say, "Good news, my agents have found your stolen silver, and for a fee, I can get it back for you." He was stealing from people and then selling their own stuff back to them, and they thanked him for it. He kept a ledger of every thief in his employ. If you followed his rules, you got rich. If you tried to work independently, or if you became more trouble than you were worth, Wild would simply put a cross next to your name in his book. A second cross meant he would discover you, arrest you, testify against you, and collect the £40 for your execution. It was the invention of the double cross, and for a decade, it made him untouchable. But then came Jack. Born in the poverty of White's Row in 1702, Jack Sheppard was never supposed to be a threat to a man like Wild. He was a sickly kid, raised in the workhouse, who eventually found his footing as an apprentice carpenter in Wych Street. And this is the key detail that Wild overlooked. Jack wasn't just a thug, he was a craftsman. He spent his teenage years building the very houses and doors that locked people in. He understood the physics of wood and iron. He knew that a sash window had counterweights. He knew how mortar bound bricks together, and he knew that every lock had a mechanism that could be reversed. Jack's descent into the underworld started the way it did for thousands of others, at the bottom of a gin bottle. He began frequenting the Black Lion Tavern, a notorious haunt for the underclass, where he fell in love with a woman named Edgeworth Bess. Bess was a prostitute and a thief, and to impress her, Jack started using his carpentry skills to rob the houses he was supposed to be fixing. He was good at it. Too good. And in London, if you were a good thief, you eventually came to the attention of Jonathan Wild. Wild wanted Jack under his thumb. He wanted his cut. But Jack Sheppard had a streak of arrogance that was wider than the Thames. He refused to pay the tax. He refused to kiss the ring. So, Wild did what he always did. He marked Jack for prison. The first arrest was almost insulting. Jack was thrown into the St. Giles roundhouse, a stone lockup that was considered secure for a petty thief. Jack didn't even wait for the sun to go down. While the Beadles were downstairs, likely drinking, Jack climbed up to the timber roof. He used his knowledge of joinery to find the weak beams, smashed through the ceiling, and lowered himself into the churchyard using a sheet. He was still wearing his leg irons. He landed in the middle of a crowd that had gathered at the noise, and instead of panicking, he pointed to the roof and shouted, "There he goes, I see him!" blending in with the mob just long enough to vanish into the fog. This escape was an annoyance to Wilde, but it wasn't a disaster yet. Wilde upped the stakes. He tracked down Bess, got her drunk, and coerced her into giving up Jack's location. They were both arrested and thrown into the new prison at Clerkenwell. This was a serious facility, a fortress with 20-foot walls. Wilde thought this was the end of it. He thought he could leave Jack there to rot until the trial. But Jack looked at the cell in Clerkenwell and just saw another carpentry problem. He had files smuggled in, likely by his associates. He cut through the iron fetters on his own legs, and then he cut the fetters off Bess, but the window was barred with thick iron. Jack cut through the bars, but he didn't just jump. He tied blankets and sheets together to make a rope. Now, here is the thing. Jack was a tiny man, barely 5'4". Bess was described as a large, voluptuous woman. The physics of getting her up to the window and down the 20-foot wall were impossible, yet somehow he did it. They scrambled over the wall, leaving the prison authorities staring at an empty cell and a broken window. By now, the streets of London were buzzing. The thief-taker general was looking incompetent. A 22-year-old kid was making a mockery of the king's justice. Wilde realized he had to end this permanently. He used his vast network of spies to find Jack again, and this time he ensured Jack was sent to Newgate. Newgate Prison was the end of the line. It was a massive, terrifying structure that sat over the city gate like a tombstone. It was a place of disease, darkness, and misery. Jack was convicted on 3 charges of burglary. The judge sentenced him to death. He was put in the condemned hold, waiting for the cart that would take him to Tyburn to be hanged. But Jack wasn't done. On August 31st, the death warrant arrived. His execution was set for that Friday. 2 women, Bess and another friend named Poll Maggot, came to the prison lodge to say goodbye. The lodge was separated from the street by a heavy iron hatch with vertical bars. The guards were relaxed. Jack was a dead man walking, and they let the women talk to him. While the women distracted the guards, likely with tears and drama, Jack was working on one of the iron spikes of the hatch. He gripped the iron bar and began to rock it. He worked the metal until it snapped. Now, the gap created by the missing bar was tiny. It was impossibly small, but Jack was desperate. He pushed his head through, then forced his shoulders, contorting his body in a way that seemed inhuman until he squeezed through the hatch. The women threw a dress over him to hide his irons, and he walked right out the front door of Newgate Prison, past the guards, and into the London night. This was the moment Jack Sheppard went from a criminal to a folk hero. The working class of London, who lived under the crushing weight of poverty and laws designed to keep them down, saw Jack as a symbol. He was the little guy who couldn't be caged. They called him Jack the Lad. They wrote songs about him. Jonathan Wilde was furious. His reputation was bleeding out. He put a massive bounty on Jack's head. He had his men scouring every alehouse and gin shop in the city. And because Jack was young and reckless, he didn't leave London. He went to the country for a few days but got bored and came back to his old haunts. Wilde's men caught him on Finchley Common, and this time they dragged him back to Newgate with a vengeance. The prison governor was humiliated. He wasn't going to let this happen again. They took Jack to the castle, the strongest room in the entire prison. They chained him to the floor with massive iron staples. They put him in handcuffs and heavy leg irons. They threatened the guards with death if he escaped again. People paid admission just to come into the cell and look at him, chained to the floor like a wild animal. Jack would joke with them, telling them to watch their pockets. October 15th, 1724. The date that cemented the legend. That afternoon, Jack's associate, Blueskin Blake, was being tried in the Old Bailey next door. Jonathan Wilde was testifying against him. In a moment of pure rage, Blueskin leaped from the dock and slashed Wilde's throat with a penknife. The court erupted in chaos. Wilde was carried out bleeding, barely clinging to life. The confusion rippled through the prison. The guards were distracted. Jack was alone in the castle. It was dark. He had nothing but his clothes and a small crooked nail he had found on the floor. He sat on the cold stone and went to work. He He used the nail to pick the padlock on his handcuffs, holding the pin between his teeth. It took patience, but the lock clicked open. His hands were free, but he was still bolted to the floor by the leg irons. The staples were thick iron, driven deep into the stone. Jack grabbed the heavy chain of his leg irons, twisted it around the staple to create a lever, and pulled. He pulled until the muscles in his back screamed until the stone cracked. With a violent crack, the staple ripped out of the floor. He was free of the floor, but he was still wearing the heavy irons on his legs. He looked up. The chimney. It was the only way out, but it was blocked by an iron bar set into the brickwork. Jack climbed up into the soot-choked flue. He used the broken link of his chain as a tool, clawing at the mortar, digging at the bricks until his fingers were raw. He ripped the iron bar out of the wall. He climbed up the chimney and emerged into the Red Room, a cell that had been sealed shut for 7 years since the Jacobite uprising. It was pitch black. He was covered in soot and blood. But he wasn't out yet. He faced a massive door bolted from the other side. Jack felt for the lockbox. He broke through the wood, reached his arm through, and forced the bolt back. He moved into the chapel. Another door. Then another. 6 doors in total stood between him and the roof. He picked locks with the crooked nail. He used the iron bar from the chimney as a crowbar to smash through reinforced oak. He moved through the prison like a ghost, dismantling the architecture of his captivity piece by piece. He reached the roof. He was 60 feet above the street. The wind hit his face. He looked down at the drop and realized he had made a fatal error. He had no rope. He had no way down. Most men would have given up. They would have sat on the roof and waited to be caught. Jack Sheppard turned around. He went back into the prison. He went back down through the broken doors, all the way back to his cell in the castle. He grabbed the blanket from his bed. Then he climbed the chimney again, went through the Red Room, through the chapel, and back to the roof. He tied the blanket to a stone pinnacle, lowered himself onto the roof of a neighboring house, the home of a turner named William Bird. He found an attic window open. He climbed inside, crept down the stairs, past the sleeping family, unlocked the front door, and stepped out into the street. It was after midnight. He hailed a coach and disappeared. London did not just react, it exploded. The news of the castle escape travelled faster than the plague. It was impossible. It was magic. Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, visited Jack to write his biography. The king demanded to see a sketch of the chains. Jack Sheppard was now Gentleman Jack. For 2 weeks, he lived like a king. He broke into a pawnbroker's shop in Drury Lane, not for food, but for style. He stole a black silk suit, a silver-hilted sword, and a diamond ring. He walked the streets openly. He drank in the taverns, toasting his own health. He was drunk on fame, and perhaps he knew the ride was almost over. On November 1st, they found him. He was in a tavern, blind drunk, wearing the stolen silk suit. He didn't fight. He was too wasted to stand. They dragged him back to Newgate, but this time, the game changed. They put him in the middle stone room, right in the center of the complex where he could be watched from all sides. They loaded him with 300 pounds of iron weights. They kept him there, a spectacle for the wealthy to gawk at until the day of his execution. November 16th, 1724, the day London stopped. The procession to Tyburn, the place of execution near modern-day Marble Arch, was usually a solemn affair. For Jack, it was a carnival. The crowds were estimated at 200,000 people. To put that in perspective, that was 1/3 of the entire population of London at the time. They lined Oxford Street, hanging from windows, climbing lampposts. They weren't there to jeer. They were there to say goodbye to their boy. Jack sat in the cart, the rope already around his neck, smiling and waving. He stopped at the City of Oxford Tavern for a final pint of sack. He had a plan, of course. He always had a plan. He had hidden a small penknife in his pocket, intending to cut the ropes at the scaffold and dive into the massive crowd, trusting them to smuggle him away. But as he mounted the scaffold, a guard spotted the knife and confiscated it. The last trick had failed. When the cart pulled away and Jack was left swinging, the crowd didn't disperse. They surged forward. In those days, bodies were often taken by surgeons for dissection. The mob wasn't having it. They fought the officials, grabbed Jack's body, and carried it away to keep it safe. Some say they tried to revive him, rubbing his limbs and trying to bleed him, desperate to bring the lad back to life. But he was gone. He was buried that night in the churchyard of St. Martin in the Fields. However, Jack's ghost had one final act of vengeance. The illusion of Jonathan Wild's power was shattered. Jack had proven that the thief-taker general was just a man who could be beaten. The public turned on Wild. His criminal empire began to crumble as his own thieves realized he wasn't invincible. They started testifying against him. 6 months after Jack died, Jonathan Wild was arrested. He was charged with the very crimes he had spent a decade framing others for. He was put in Newgate, in the very cells he had filled with his victims. The night before his execution, terrified of the mob, Wild tried to commit suicide by drinking laudanum, but he only managed to make himself sick. When they carted Wild to Tyburn, the contrast was brutal. Where Jack had received flowers, Wild received stones. The crowd screamed at him, cursed him, and pelted him with mud and filth all the way to the gallows. He died a hated man, terrified and alone, while the name of the boy he tried to crush lived on in plays, books, and songs for 300 years. But Jack didn't really die at Tyburn. In a way, he just walked off the scaffold and straight into legend. Even as the crowd was fighting over his body, people were selling copies of his autobiography right there at the gallows. And this wasn't just some cheap pamphlet. It was a narrative, almost certainly ghost-written by Daniel Defoe, the man who wrote Robinson Crusoe. Think about that. One of the greatest writers in history sat down in a cell with a 22-year-old burglar and then went on to achieve success while poor Jack, unfortunately, had his story cut short. When you just look at the human being, it is genuinely heartbreaking. This wasn't a violent man. He was a kid with the mind of an engineer and the hands of a master craftsman. He dismantled the strongest prison in England in the dark with nothing but a crooked nail. Imagine if that genius had been turned toward building bridges or cathedrals or ships. He could have been the greatest architect of his generation. He had his whole life ahead of him. And for what was it all cut short? A black silk suit, a silver spoon. Under the brutal, bloody code of the 18th century, these petty crimes were enough to snap a neck. It feels almost insane to us now. We live in a world where people seem to get away with absolutely anything, where consequences feel like a suggestion. But in Jack's London, the line between survival and the grave was razor thin. He wasn't evil. He was just a brilliant, desperate boy who was crushed by a system that valued a piece of cloth more than a human mind. And that is the real tragedy of 1724. Not that a criminal died, but that a genius was thrown away for nothing. Thank you for watching. If you want to learn more about history, get the Paladin app today and take your knowledge to the next level.